"Get out of my house before I call the police myself," Alexander Whitmore roared, his hand closing around his wife's arm as he dragged her toward the front door, rain hammering the windows like the storm itself was screaming in protest. Claire didn't beg. She didn't cry out. She simply stared into the eyes of the man who had just accused her, his own wife, of stealing from an empire built entirely on her family's silent fortune, as he shoved her barefoot into the freezing night and slammed the door shut behind her. He had no idea that single cruel act had just triggered the collapse of everything he owned. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The rain came down in sheets over the hills of Boston that night, hammering against the windows of a mansion that looked, from the outside, like a monument to everything a man could ever want. Inside, Alexander Whitmore stood in his study with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a printed bank statement in the other, and his face was not the face of a man who had been caught. It was the face of a man who was furious that he had been seen. "Explain this to me," Claire said, her voice steady even though her hands were trembling. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with the transaction history she had pulled up not 20 minutes earlier. $120,000, Alexander. Moved out of our joint account into a company I have never heard of. Alexander did not even look at her right away. He took a slow sip of his drink first, letting the silence stretch, the way he always did when he wanted her to feel small before he even opened his mouth. "It's business, Claire," he finally said. "Something you wouldn't understand." "Try me." He set the glass down harder than he needed to. "You want me to sit here and explain venture allocations to someone who spent the last 8 years arranging flowers and picking out curtains? That's cute." Claire felt something crack inside her chest, but she didn't let it show on her face. Not yet. "I'm not asking about venture allocations. I'm asking why money disappeared from our account into something with your name quietly attached to it. That's not a business question, Alexander. That's a marriage question. Don't lecture me in my own house. Our house." He laughed, and it wasn't a warm sound. It was sharp, almost cruel. "Our house. Claire, do you have any idea what this house cost? Do you have any idea what it takes to keep a place like this running, to keep the lights on, to keep the staff paid, to keep everyone around us convinced that we belong in the rooms we walk into? You didn't build any of that. I did. I have stood beside you every single day for 8 years, Claire said, her voice rising now, no longer able to hold the calm she had walked in with. I have smiled at your investors. I have hosted your dinners. I have stayed quiet when you humiliated me in front of your colleagues because you said it was good for business. And now you're standing here telling me I don't understand what it takes to run this house. You're being dramatic. I found $120,000 missing, Alexander. Tell me I'm being dramatic. For the first time that night, something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked almost like panic, before he buried it under another wave of anger. And that was when Claire understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that he wasn't going to explain anything. He was going to attack. You know what your problem is? He said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. You've never had to earn anything in your life. You married a man who gave you everything, and instead of being grateful, you stand here interrogating me like I owe you an explanation for how I run my own empire. Your empire, Claire repeated quietly. That's right. Funny, she said. I don't remember signing up to be grateful. I remember signing up to be your partner. Something in him seemed to snap at that word. Partner. He stepped forward so fast that Claire instinctively took a step back, and for the first time in 8 years of marriage, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel around him before. Fear. You will not stand in my house, Alexander said, his voice shaking now with rage, and question how I make money. Do you understand me? I will absolutely stand in this house, Claire shot back, refusing to back down even as her pulse hammered in her ears, and ask where our money is going because I am your wife, not your assistant, and not someone you get to silence whenever it's convenient for you. The slap of his palm against the desk was so loud that Claire flinched. Papers scattered. The whiskey glass tipped and rolled off the edge, shattering against the hardwood floor, and in the sudden silence that followed, Claire heard her own heartbeat pounding louder than the rain against the windows. "Get out," Alexander said. Claire blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Get out of my study." "This isn't over, Alexander. I want answers." "I said get out." She turned to leave, not because she was giving up, but because she needed a moment to breathe, a moment away from the man whose face she barely recognized anymore. But as she walked toward the hallway, Alexander's hand closed around her arm again, harder this time, and he spun her around to face him. "Let go of me," Claire said, her voice low and dangerous now in a way that surprised even her. "You want to talk about respect?" Alexander said, ignoring her completely, his grip tightening. "You want to talk about partnership? Let me remind you of something, Claire. Everything you have, this house, these clothes, this life, exists because of me. Without me, you are nothing. You would be back to whatever small, forgettable life you had before you met me." Those words landed somewhere deep, somewhere old, somewhere Claire had buried a long time ago, but she did not let him see it shake her. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes. "You have no idea what my life was before you," she said quietly. "None." Something about the calm in her voice seemed to enrage him even further, because in the next breath, Alexander was dragging her toward the front entrance, his hand still locked around her arm, and Claire was too stunned to fully process what was happening until she felt the cold rush of night air hit her skin. "Alexander, what are you doing?" "Teaching you a lesson. Let go of me right now." He didn't. He pulled the heavy front door open with his free hand, and the storm outside roared in, wind and rain slashing sideways across the entryway, and before Claire could plant her feet, before she could fully understand what was about to happen, Alexander shoved her forward with enough force that she stumbled onto the marble steps outside. "Alexander!" The door slammed shut behind her. Claire stood frozen for a moment, rain soaking through her thin sweater instantly, plastering her hair to her face, and she reached for the handle out of pure instinct, twisting it once, twice, feeling the lock click uselessly under her palm. "Alexander, open this door!" Nothing. "Alexander!" She pounded her fist against the heavy wood, once, twice, and somewhere in the back of her mind she registered how strange it felt to be locked out of a house she had walked through 1,000 times, a house where she knew every creak in the floor, every painting on the wall, every room that held some memory of the life she had tried so hard to build. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see him. Alexander had already turned his back and was walking calmly toward the kitchen, as if nothing at all had happened, as if his wife wasn't standing barefoot in a storm just a few feet away from him. Claire stopped pounding. She stood there, rain running down her face, mixing with something that wasn't quite tears, not yet, and she watched him through the glass, watched him pour himself another drink, watched him settle into the leather armchair by the fireplace with the same relaxed posture he might use after closing a difficult deal. He thinks he won, Claire thought, and for one dangerous second, standing there freezing in the storm with nowhere to go and no one coming to help her, she almost let herself believe that maybe he had. But then something inside her shifted. It wasn't sadness that rose up first. It was clarity, sharp, cold, absolute clarity, the kind that only comes when every illusion you've been living inside of finally shatters at once. She thought about the last 8 years, the small comments that chipped away at her confidence one at a time, the way he introduced her at parties as my wife and nothing more, never by her name, never by anything she had built or accomplished, just an accessory attached to his success. The way he had slowly convinced her to leave her job at the Art Foundation, telling her it wasn't necessary anymore, that her place was here, managing his home, managing his image. She thought about the nights she had made excuses to friends who noticed the bruises on her spirit long before there were ever any on her skin. She thought about the woman she used to be before any of this, before Alexander Whitmore, before the mansion, before she had buried the truth of who she really was so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed, and standing there in the rain, locked outside a house that had never truly needed his money to exist, Claire Harrington finally remembered exactly who she was. Not Claire Whitmore, the quiet wife of a wealthy businessman. Claire Harrington. The rain didn't feel as cold anymore. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a slow breath, and reached into the pocket of her cardigan for her phone. Her fingers were shaking, but not from fear this time. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. "Claire?" Jonathan Pierce sounded surprised, and then immediately alert, the way people who had known her family for decades always were, the instant something felt wrong. "It's late. Is everything all right?" Claire looked back at the mansion window one last time. Alexander was laughing at something on his phone now, completely unaware, completely comfortable, completely convinced that the woman he had just thrown out into a storm would spend the night crying on the doorstep, waiting to be let back in. "No," Claire said quietly, "everything is not all right. Talk to me. He locked me out, Jonathan." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that told Claire that Jonathan Pierce, a man who had spent 20 years managing legal affairs for some of the most powerful families in the country, understood immediately the weight of those 5 words. "He locked you out of your own home?" "He pushed me outside and locked the door. I'm standing in the rain right now." "Where are you? I'm sending a car." "I'm fine," Claire said, and for the first time in years, her voice carried a tone Jonathan hadn't heard from her since she was in her 20s, before she disappeared from that world entirely. "I don't need a car. I need something else." "Tell me." Claire glanced once more through the glass. Alexander had gotten up from his chair now, wandering toward the kitchen, completely unbothered, whistling something under his breath. "Do you remember everything my father set up before he passed?" Claire asked. "The trusts, the shell structures, the way our family has quietly held pieces of companies without anyone realizing where the money actually comes from?" "Of course." "Alexander's company," Claire said slowly. "His mansion, his entire lifestyle. How much of it runs through us?" There was a long pause, and then Jonathan's voice came back, careful, measured, but with something underneath it that sounded almost like disbelief. "Claire, are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking you," Claire said, watching the rain blur the lights of the mansion into streaks of gold, "whether the man who just locked his wife outside in a storm understands that everything he thinks he owns could disappear before sunrise." "He doesn't know," Jonathan said. "Does he?" "No," Claire whispered. "He has no idea who he married." "Do you want me to make some calls?" Claire stood there for a long moment, rain running down her spine, cold seeping into her bare feet, and somewhere behind that window, Alexander Whitmore was still smiling, still comfortable, still completely unaware that his entire world had just tilted on its axis without him feeling a single tremor. "Claire?" Jonathan said again. "Do you want protection? Security? I can have someone there in 10 minutes. "No," Claire said, and her voice had gone completely still now, completely calm, the calm of someone who had already made a decision long before she picked up the phone. "I don't want protection." "Then what do you want?" Claire looked one final time at the man inside the warm, glowing house, the man who had spent 8 years convincing her she was lucky to exist beside him, the man who had just thrown her out into a storm without a second thought. "I want him to understand," she said quietly, "exactly what it feels like to have everything and lose it in one night." The line went silent for a moment. "Are you sure?" Jonathan asked. "Once we start this, Claire, there's no undoing it." Claire wiped rain from her cheek, and for the first time since the door had slammed shut behind her, something that almost resembled a smile crossed her face, though there was nothing warm about it. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then I'll make the call within the hour." "Good." "Claire," Jonathan added, his voice softening slightly, the way it might have when she was a much younger woman running from a life she never asked for. "For what it's worth, I always wondered when this day would come." "So did I," Claire said. "I just didn't expect it to start with rain." She ended the call and stood there a moment longer, watching Alexander Whitmore move through the golden light of the house he believed belonged entirely to him, a house built on money he had never truly earned, resting on a foundation he didn't even know existed. Somewhere behind that glass, a phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and Alexander glanced at it without much interest. Some notification from his company account. Probably nothing important, he thought. Probably something that could wait until morning. He had no idea it was the first tremor of the collapse that was already racing toward him. Claire turned and walked slowly down the front steps, barefoot, soaked, and for the first time in 8 years, completely and entirely free. She didn't look back at the mansion again. She didn't need to, because somewhere across the city, a phone call was already being made, a call that would move through banks and boardrooms and legal offices before the sun rose, a call that would begin quietly unwinding every thread of the empire Alexander Whitmore believed he had built with his own 2 hands. He was still inside, warm and comfortable, refilling his glass, checking his phone one more time, completely unaware that somewhere in the storm outside, the woman he had just discarded like she meant nothing had just made one single phone call. And that one phone call was about to destroy absolutely everything he owned. Part 2. The rain hadn't let up by the time Claire slid into the back of the car Jonathan sent anyway, despite her telling him she didn't need one. She was soaked through, her feet numb against the leather seat, but her mind had never felt clearer in her life. As the car pulled away from the mansion, she watched the golden windows shrink in the side mirror, watched the house that had swallowed 8 years of her life disappear into the storm behind her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. Not happiness. Not yet. But relief, the kind that comes when a weight you've carried for so long that you forgot it was even there, finally lifts off your shoulders. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Jonathan. "Are you in the car?" he asked the moment she picked up. "I'm in the car." "Good. I need you to think very carefully before I make the calls I'm about to make, Claire, because once this starts, there is no quiet way to stop it. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Claire stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, smearing gold across the glass. "I understand. I need you to say it back to me. Tell me exactly what you want." She closed her eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw 8 years pass in fragments. The wedding, where Alexander had barely looked at her during the vows because he was checking his phone under the table. The dinner parties, where he introduced her only as "my wife" to men twice her age, who then spoke about her like she wasn't standing there. The night she told him she wanted to go back to the Art Foundation, and he laughed, actually laughed, and told her that working a 9-to-5 job would embarrass him in front of his investors. The slow, quiet erosion of a woman who used to know exactly who she was. "I want every account connected to him reviewed by morning," Claire said, her voice steady now, stripped of any tremor. "I want the board notified of irregular transfers before he wakes up tomorrow. I want Harrington Capital to exercise its position as majority shareholder and call an emergency vote. And I want the trust to reclaim the mansion." There was a pause on the line, and when Jonathan spoke again, there was something almost like pride in his voice, though he tried to keep it professional. "Your father would be proud of you right now." Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at the mention of her father, a man who had died 4 years earlier without ever meeting the man she married, a man who had built an empire out of nothing and taught his daughter that real power never needed to raise its voice to be heard. "My father warned me about men like him," Claire said quietly. "I just didn't want to believe it applied to me." "None of us ever want to believe it applies to us," Jonathan said gently. "That's how they get in." "How long until it starts?" "The board notification goes out within the hour. Harrington Capital's position in Whitmore Ventures is substantial enough that once we flag irregular transfers, the board has no choice but to act. By morning, his access to company accounts will be frozen pending investigation. The mansion is a separate matter that runs through the family trust, and I'll need your signature, but I can have papers ready by sunrise." "Do it." "Claire," Jonathan's voice softened again, "are you safe right now? Physically, I mean. Did he hurt you?" Claire thought about the bruising grip on her arm, the way he had shoved her through the door like she weighed nothing, like 8 years of marriage weighed nothing. "I'm fine," she said. "He didn't hit me. He threw me out into a storm and locked the door, Jonathan, like I was nothing, like I was garbage he needed to take out. That's enough, Jonathan said, and his voice had an edge to it now that Claire rarely heard from the calm, measured attorney she'd known since childhood. That's more than enough. The car turned onto the highway, and Claire watched the city lights blur past the window, and for the first time in years, she let herself think about who she used to be before all of this. Before the mansion. Before the isolation. Before she had convinced herself that shrinking herself smaller and smaller was the price of being loved. Her mind drifted back nearly 9 years, to a small gallery opening on a rainy Thursday evening, back when she still went by nothing but Claire, no last name attached, no fortune trailing behind her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She had been working at the Art Foundation for 2 years by then, finally free from the suffocating weight of the Harrington name, finally able to walk into a room and be seen as just a woman who loved art rather than an heiress everyone wanted something from. That was the night she met Alexander. He had walked into the gallery in a sharp gray suit, confident, charming, asking intelligent questions about the pieces on display that made her think foolishly that he actually cared about art rather than simply performing the part of a man who understood culture. He had made her laugh within 10 minutes. He had asked for her number within 30. "What do you do?" he had asked her that night, leaning against the wall beside a painting she'd spent hours arranging the lighting for. "I work here," she'd said simply. "I help curate the shows." "And outside of here? What's your story?" She remembered smiling at that question because for the first time in years, someone had asked about her story without already knowing the ending, without already knowing about the Harrington fortune, the private jets, the summer estates. To Alexander that night, she was simply Claire. "Nothing very interesting," she'd told him. "I like quiet things, quiet rooms, quiet Sundays." "I don't believe that for a second," he'd said. And something about the way he looked at her, like he actually saw her, had made her chest ache with a hope she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. She had no idea, standing in that gallery 9 years ago, that the man smiling at her so warmly would one day stand in a study and tell her that everything she had existed only because of him. The car hit a pothole, jolting Claire back to the present, back to the rain streaking the windows, back to the phone still warm against her ear. "Claire, are you still there?" "I'm here," she said. "I was just thinking about how it started." "You don't have to explain that to me," Jonathan said. "I've watched enough good people fall for enough charming men to know exactly how it starts. It never starts with cruelty. It starts with attention. That's what makes it so hard to see coming." "He made me feel like I was the only person in the room," Claire admitted. "For the first 6 months, I thought I'd finally found someone who loved me for exactly who I was, not what I came from. And then?" Claire watched the rain trace long silver lines down the glass. "And then he started asking why I needed to keep working when he made enough money for both of us. Then he started commenting on which friends I was spending time with, saying they were a bad influence, saying they didn't understand what it meant to build something real. Then one day I looked up and realized I hadn't spoken to my college roommate in over a year, hadn't been to the gallery in months, hadn't done anything that didn't somehow revolve around him. That's not love, Claire. That's architecture. He built a cage around you slowly enough that you never felt the walls closing in." Claire closed her eyes. "I know that now." "You always knew it," Jonathan said gently. "You just weren't ready to admit it yet. Tonight, he admitted it for you." The car slowed as it approached the private airstrip where the Harrington family jet was kept fueled and ready at all times, a habit her father had insisted on decades ago, one Claire had never used for herself in the 8 years since her marriage. "Where am I going?" she asked, suddenly realizing she hadn't actually told the driver a destination. "Home," Jonathan said. "Your real home, the estate in Connecticut. Your brother is already there. I called him the moment you called me." Claire felt her stomach tighten. "You called Marcus?" "Of course I called Marcus. He's the head of the family office now, Claire. He needs to be involved in what happens next, and frankly, I think you need your family around you tonight." Claire hadn't seen her older brother in almost 2 years, not since she'd made an excuse about a scheduling conflict at their father's memorial gathering, an excuse Alexander had insisted on because he had an important dinner that same weekend and didn't want her missing it to attend a family event. She remembered the sting of that moment now with startling clarity, remembered choosing her husband's business dinner over her father's memory, and something hot and furious rose in her chest. "He's going to say, 'I told him so,'" Claire murmured. "He's not," Jonathan said firmly. "Marcus has been waiting 8 years to help you, not to lecture you. He just didn't know how to reach you without pushing you further away." The car merged onto a private road lined with tall, dark trees, and within minutes, the headlights swept across the wrought iron gates of an estate Claire hadn't visited in what felt like a different lifetime. As the gates opened and the car rolled up the long gravel drive, Claire saw the lights of the main house glowing warmly through the rain, and standing on the front steps, waiting despite the storm, was her brother. Marcus Harrington looked older than she remembered, streaks of gray now threading through his dark hair. But his eyes were exactly the same, sharp and steady and full of a concern he clearly hadn't allowed himself to show her for years, because she hadn't given him the chance. The moment the car stopped, he was already moving down the steps toward her, and when Claire stepped out into the rain, still barefoot, still soaked, he didn't say a single word about how long it had been or how much he'd worried. He simply pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered into his shoulder, her voice finally breaking for the first time that night. "I'm so sorry I disappeared." "You didn't disappear," Marcus said quietly, holding her tighter. "You survived. There's a difference." Inside, the house was warm, and someone had already set out dry clothes and hot tea, and Claire sat curled in an armchair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching her brother pace back and forth across the room, with his phone pressed to his ear, already deep in conversation with the family's financial team. "I want a full audit of Whitmore Ventures by 6 a.m., Marcus said into the phone, his voice carrying the same commanding authority their father used to have. "Every account, every transfer, every shell company connected to his name for the last 5 years. If there's a single irregularity, I want it on my desk before breakfast." Claire watched him work, watched the quiet, controlled fury in his movements, and felt something settle in her chest. For 8 years, she had felt entirely alone, convinced that the life she'd chosen meant she had to face its consequences by herself. But sitting in that room, watching her brother mobilize an entire financial empire on her behalf without a second of hesitation, she realized she had never actually been alone. She had simply forgotten how to ask for help. "How bad is it?" Claire asked when Marcus finally ended the call and sank into the chair across from her. "Bad enough," Marcus said grimly. "Preliminary numbers suggest he's been siphoning funds out of joint accounts and shell entities for at least 2 years. Small amounts at first, growing larger recently. Whether that's because he was getting desperate or getting greedy, we don't know yet." 2 years, Claire repeated, feeling sick. "I had no idea." "You weren't supposed to have any idea," Marcus said. "That was the entire point. Men like him don't just take money, Claire. They take away your ability to notice it's missing." Claire pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What happens now?" "Now," Marcus said, leaning forward, his eyes hard, "we make sure Alexander Whitmore understands exactly what he built his entire life on top of." Across the city, inside the mansion that no longer belonged to him, even though he didn't know it yet, Alexander Whitmore poured himself a second glass of whiskey and settled back into his leather chair by the fire, feeling for the first time all evening completely relaxed. He checked his phone. A missed call from an unknown number. He dismissed it without a second thought. He thought about Claire standing outside in the rain, and a small, satisfied smile crossed his face. She'd come around by morning, he told himself. She always did. She'd knock on the door apologetic and humbled, and he'd let her back in, and everything would return exactly to how it should be, with him in control, the way it had always been. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Natalie. "Thinking about you tonight. When can I see the new apartment? You said this week." Alexander smiled, typing back a quick response promising the keys by Friday, a promise he had no real intention of following through on for at least another month, not until the current business quarter closed and he had more liquid cash to work with. He didn't think twice about the lie. He never did. He had no idea that within hours there would be no liquid cash left to promise anyone anything with. His phone rang again, An actual call this time, and he glanced at the screen expecting it to be Claire finally caving, finally calling to beg to be let back inside. Instead, it was his chief financial officer, David Reyes, and something about the timestamp, nearly midnight on a Tuesday, made a small flicker of unease cross Alexander's otherwise satisfied expression. "David," Alexander answered, keeping his voice light. "Bit late for a call, isn't it?" "Alexander." David's voice was tight, clipped, nothing like his usual relaxed tone. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "I just got an emergency notification from the board. Someone flagged irregularities in the Meridian account transfers. They're calling for an internal audit starting tonight." Alexander sat up straighter in his chair, the relaxed satisfaction draining out of his face in an instant. "Tonight? Who authorized an audit at midnight?" "That's the thing," David said, and Alexander could hear the confusion and something like fear in his voice. "It wasn't internal. The notification came directly from Harrington Capital. They're exercising shareholder authority to demand immediate review." The name hit Alexander like a physical blow, though he couldn't understand exactly why yet, couldn't place the sudden cold dread pooling in his stomach. "Harrington Capital," Alexander repeated slowly. "Why would our largest institutional shareholder care about routine transfers at midnight?" "I don't know," David said. "But Alexander, I need you to be straight with me right now, because if there's something in those accounts that shouldn't be there, I need to know before this audit starts pulling threads neither of us can control." Alexander's jaw tightened. "There's nothing in those accounts that concerns you." "Alexander." "There's nothing there, David. It's routine business restructuring. I'll handle the board myself in the morning." He ended the call abruptly, his hand gripping the phone hard enough that his knuckles went white, and for the first time that night, the confident, controlled expression Alexander Whitmore wore like armor began to crack around the edges. Harrington Capital. He knew the name, of course. Every serious player in the investment world knew the name. A private, notoriously secretive family fund that held significant stakes in dozens of major companies without ever putting their name on a single press release. Run by a family so wealthy and so private that most people in the industry had never even seen a photograph of the people actually controlling it. He had always assumed Harrington Capital's stake in Whitmore Ventures was simply smart institutional diversification. One investor among many, nothing personal, nothing targeted. It had never once occurred to him, in 8 years of marriage, to ask why a fund with that particular name had taken such an early, aggressive position in his company right around the time he started dating a quiet woman from an art gallery who never talked about her family. He poured himself another drink, his hand not quite as steady this time, and told himself it was nothing. Coincidence. Bureaucratic overreach from a nervous institutional investor. He'd smooth it over in the morning the way he smoothed over everything, with charm and confidence and the absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone in the room. He had no idea that 4 miles away, in a warmly lit study inside a Connecticut estate he'd never once been invited to in 8 years of marriage, his wife was sitting across from her brother, watching him build the case that would end everything Alexander Whitmore had ever believed about his own life. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said, his voice careful now as he looked at his sister. "Something Dad set up before he passed. I don't think you were ever told the full details, because you'd already left by the time the final structure was finalized." Claire frowned, pulling the blanket tighter. "Told the full details of what?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at Jonathan, who gave a small, confirming nod. "The mansion Alexander lives in," Marcus said slowly. "The one he locked you outside of tonight." "What about it?" "It was never purchased by Whitmore Ventures. It was purchased through a private trust 3 years before you even met him, back when Dad was quietly acquiring high-value real estate assets in major cities as part of the family's long-term portfolio strategy." "Alexander didn't buy that house, Claire. He leased it, through a shell arrangement structured to look like ownership, from a trust that has belonged to this family for over a decade." Claire sat perfectly still, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "That's not possible." "He's shown me the deed. He's talked about the property taxes for years." "He's been shown documents designed to make him believe he owns it," Jonathan said gently. "It's a common structure for high-value discrete holdings, Claire. The paperwork he has access to shows him as the owner on paper for tax and privacy purposes, but the underlying trust, the one that actually controls the asset, has always belonged to your family. How is that even possible? How did he end up living in a house owned by my own father, years before he ever met me, without either of us knowing? Coincidence mostly, Marcus admitted. Your father acquired dozens of properties like that across the country, purely as investments, long before Alexander Whitmore was ever on anyone's radar. When you married him and he moved into that particular mansion, none of us made the connection right away, because frankly, none of us were paying close enough attention to your life to notice, and I regret that more than I can say. Claire pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to process the sheer scale of what she was hearing. So this entire time, I've been locked out of a house that was already mine, that my own family already owned. In a manner of speaking, yes, Jonathan said, which makes tomorrow considerably simpler than I initially expected. Claire lowered her hands, staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and crack, feeling something shift inside her chest that felt less like grief now and more like resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He's been living in my father's house this entire time, she said quietly, almost to herself. Sleeping under a roof that was never his, building a life on top of a foundation he never actually owned. It gets more complicated, Marcus said carefully. Claire looked up. How much more complicated? Marcus exchanged another glance with Jonathan before continuing. Whitmore Ventures itself, the company Alexander built his entire reputation around, the one he's always credited entirely to his own vision and hard work. What about it? Its earliest and largest round of funding, Marcus said slowly, came through an anonymous holding structure connected directly to Harrington Capital. Before you ever met him, Claire, before any of us knew he existed. Claire felt the room tilt again, more violently this time. That's not possible. He always talked about how he built that company from nothing, how he bootstrapped everything himself, how no one gave him a single advantage. That's the story he tells, Jonathan said. It isn't entirely true. Your father's fund quietly backed dozens of early-stage companies across multiple industries, Claire, long before you ever met Alexander. It wasn't personal. It wasn't targeted. It was simply smart, diversified investing, spreading capital across promising young companies with strong founders. Whitmore Ventures happened to be one of them. So the money that built his empire, Claire said slowly, feeling something cold settle over her, came from my family before I even walked into that gallery. Essentially, yes. And the house he threw me out of tonight, Claire continued, her voice growing steadier with every word, was already ours. Also yes. Claire let out a slow breath, and for a moment nobody in the room spoke. The fire crackled. Rain continued to hammer softly against the windows outside. And somewhere across the city, a man who believed he had built an empire entirely through his own brilliance sat in a mansion he had never actually owned, drinking whiskey purchased with money that had, in some distant, tangled way, originated from the very family he had spent years dismissing as insignificant. He has no idea, Claire finally said. Does he? None, Marcus confirmed. He thinks he's the one holding all the power, Claire said. And for the first time that night, something that almost resembled a bitter laugh escaped her. This entire time, every time he made me feel small, every time he reminded me how lucky I was to have him, every single time he told me I would be nothing without him. He was standing inside a house you own, Marcus finished quietly, built on money your family provided, telling the daughter of the man who made it all possible that she should be grateful to him. Claire stood up slowly, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders, and walked to the window, staring out at the dark shapes of trees bending in the wind and rain. I want to see it, she said. See what? Jonathan asked. His face, Claire said quietly, when he finally understands. That can be arranged, Marcus said, a hard edge creeping into his voice. Sooner than you might think. The board meeting is being scheduled for tomorrow morning, emergency session. Once the audit findings hit the table, there won't be any way for him to talk his way out of it. What about tonight? Claire asked. Is there anything happening tonight? Jonathan checked his watch. Account freezes typically process through the overnight banking cycle. If the freeze order goes through in the next hour, his access to company funds and personal accounts tied to Whitmore Ventures will lock automatically before dawn. He won't notice until he tries to use a card or check a balance. Claire thought about Alexander sitting comfortably by the fire right now, pouring himself another glass of expensive whiskey, completely unaware that the ground beneath his entire life was already crumbling in the dark, while he sat there congratulating himself for winning an argument with a woman he believed had nowhere else to go. "Let it happen," Claire said. "Let him wake up and realize exactly what he's lost, piece by piece, the same way he took pieces of me for 8 years. Across the city, back inside the mansion, Alexander had finally poured his third drink of the night and settled deeper into his chair, feeling the familiar comfort of control wash back over him. The uneasy call from David had rattled him for a moment, but he'd talked himself back into confidence the way he always did, reminding himself that he had survived tougher scrutiny before, that he always found a way to smooth things over, that no board, no audit, no institutional investor had ever truly threatened him. His phone buzzed once more. Another notification. He glanced at it lazily this time, expecting nothing more than routine noise. Account alert. Unusual activity detected. Verification required. Alexander frowned, sitting up slightly, and opened the notification, expecting some minor glitch, a fraud alert on a card, nothing serious. But as he scrolled through the message, his frown deepened into something sharper, something colder. Multiple accounts flagged for review. Access temporarily restricted pending internal audit. "What the hell?" he muttered, sitting fully upright now, all traces of relaxation gone from his posture. He tried to log into his primary investment account. Access denied. He tried a second account. Access denied. His hands, steady all evening, began to move faster now, more urgently, tapping through screen after screen, each one returning the same cold mechanical message. Access temporarily restricted. "This is a mistake," he said aloud to the empty room, his voice tight, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten with a fear he refused to name. "This has to be some kind of system error." He dialed David again. No answer. He dialed his personal banker. No answer, not at this hour. Alexander stood up, pacing now, his drink forgotten on the side table, his mind racing through every possible explanation that didn't involve the terrifying thought creeping into the edges of his consciousness, the thought that somewhere out there, someone had made a decision that was already unraveling everything he believed belonged to him. He glanced toward the front window, toward the storm still raging outside, toward the empty steps where his wife had stood barefoot in the freezing rain less than 2 hours earlier. For the briefest moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Then he shook his head, refilled his glass despite his hands trembling slightly now, and told himself it was nothing. A glitch. A misunderstanding that would resolve itself by morning, the same way everything in his life always resolved itself in his favor. He had absolutely no idea that morning was going to be the beginning of the end. Somewhere across the city, inside a warm study lit by firelight, Claire Harrington sat wrapped in a blanket, watching rain streak down the window, feeling something settle deep inside her chest that felt, for the first time in 8 years, entirely like her own strength returning home. Part 3. Morning came to Boston with a pale gray light that offered no comfort, only exposure. The storm from the night before finally breaking into a thin drizzle that clung to the windows of the mansion like the city itself was still crying. Alexander Whitmore had not slept. He'd spent most of the night pacing between his study and the kitchen, refreshing account balances that refused to load, calling numbers that rang out into empty voicemail boxes. And by the time the sun rose weakly over the hills, he looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 8 hours. He splashed cold water on his face in the kitchen sink, gripping the edges of the counter, staring at his own reflection in the dark window above it. The confident, commanding businessman who had shoved his wife out into a storm the night before was gone. In his place stood someone hollowed out by a fear he didn't fully understand yet, a fear with no name, no shape, just a cold, creeping certainty that something had gone terribly wrong, and he had no idea how to stop it. His phone rang. Finally. David Reyes. "David," Alexander answered before the first ring even finished. "What is going on? I've been locked out of every account since midnight." "Alexander." David's voice sounded different this morning, careful in a way that made the hair on the back of Alexander's neck stand up. "I need you to come into the office, now, before the board meeting." "What board meeting? Nobody told me about a board meeting." "It was called at 4 this morning. Emergency session, 9 a.m. Alexander glanced at the clock on the stove, 8:15. "4 this morning? Why wasn't I notified immediately?" "You were notified," David said quietly. "Check your email." Alexander pulled the phone away from his ear and opened his inbox with trembling fingers, scrolling past dozens of unread messages until he found it. A formal notice sent at 4:17 a.m., informing him of an emergency board session called by Majority Shareholder Authority to review financial irregularities in company accounts. His stomach dropped reading the words Majority Shareholder Authority. "David," Alexander said slowly, "who called this meeting?" There was a pause, long enough that Alexander could hear his own heartbeat in the silence. "Harrington Capital," David finally said. "They're not just a shareholder anymore, Alexander. Overnight, their position increased, substantially. I don't fully understand the mechanics of it yet, some kind of trust conversion. But as of 6 a.m. this morning, Harrington Capital controls enough voting shares to force emergency governance action without board approval." Alexander felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's not possible. Nobody can just increase their position overnight without notification, without regulatory filings, without—" "It's possible," David interrupted, "when the shares were always theirs to begin with, just held through separate entities that consolidated last night. I've been on the phone with legal since 5 a.m., trying to understand it myself. Alexander, whoever is behind Harrington Capital, just showed the entire board that they've quietly held effective control of this company for years." Alexander gripped this counter so hard his knuckles went white. "For years? That's impossible. I would have known. I would have seen it in the filings." "Would you?" David's voice carried an edge now, something between fear and accusation. "Because I've been going through the historical records all night, Alexander, and there are structures here I don't recognize, holding companies nested inside holding companies, and every single one of them traces back eventually to the same family trust. Whoever these people are, they didn't just invest in Whitmore Ventures. They built the ground it's standing on." Alexander's mind raced backward through years of board meetings, investor calls, funding rounds he'd always credited to his own brilliance, his own hustle, his own late nights building pitch decks from nothing. He thought about the early investment that had saved the company from collapse in its second year, an anonymous round that came through at exactly the moment he needed it most, structured through an intermediary fund he'd never bothered investigating too closely because the money was there, and the terms were favorable, and he'd been too hungry, too desperate, too proud to ask too many questions. "Get me everything," Alexander said, his voice tight. "Every filing, every historical document connected to Harrington Capital. I want it on my desk in 20 minutes. Alexander, there isn't time. The meeting is in 45 minutes. Then get me a car." He hung up and stood frozen in his kitchen for a moment, his mind spinning through possibilities, each one worse than the last. He thought about calling Claire, some instinct telling him that whatever was happening had her fingerprints somewhere on it, though he couldn't yet imagine how a woman who had spent 8 years quietly managing his household could possibly be connected to a shareholder capable of seizing control of a multi-million-dollar company overnight. He dialed her number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. "Claire," he said, forcing his voice into something calmer than he felt. "Call me back. Something strange is happening with the company, and I need to talk to you, please." He ended the call and immediately dialed again, and this time it didn't even ring, going straight to voicemail, which meant one of 2 things. Either her phone was off, or she had specifically blocked his number, and something about that second possibility sent a genuine spike of fear through his chest for the first time all morning. He changed quickly, grabbed his keys, and headed for the garage, and it was there, standing in front of his car, that he received the text message that made his stomach drop entirely. It was from Natalie. "We need to talk. Call me when you can." He frowned, typing back a quick response asking if everything was okay, and the reply came almost instantly. "Just call me, Alex. It's important." He dialed her number as he pulled out of the garage, the drizzle spattering against his windshield. His mind now split between 3 separate crises he didn't yet know how to prioritize. "Alex," Natalie answered, her voice unusually flat. "Hey, what's going on? I got your message." "I tried to use the card you gave me this morning at the boutique on Newberry Street." A pause. "It was declined, Alex. Twice." Alexander's jaw tightened. "There's been some kind of system error with the accounts. It's being resolved." "Is it?" Natalie's voice had a sharpness to it now that Alexander had never heard from her before, not in the 8 months they'd been seeing each other. "Because I also called about the apartment you promised me, the one on the 23rd floor. And the leasing office told me there's no application on file, no deposit, nothing." "Natalie, I can explain." "Can you?" She cut him off. "Because it's starting to feel like maybe you can't. It's starting to feel like maybe none of it was ever real, Alex. The apartment, the promises, all of it." "It's real," Alexander said, gripping the steering wheel tighter as he merged onto the main road. "I just need a few days to sort out some business complications. Everything I told you is still true." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Alexander thought the call had dropped. "Natalie?" "I saw the news alert," she said quietly. "About Whitmore Ventures, emergency board meeting, financial irregularities under investigation." Alexander's stomach turned to ice. "That's already public?" "It's trending on financial Twitter, Alex. Everyone in the industry is talking about it." Another pause, colder this time. "I'm not stupid. I know what it looks like when a company is about to implode. I've dated men in finance before. I know exactly what happens next. Natalie, please, just give me a few days." "I'm not going down with you," she said flatly. "I like you, Alex, I really do, but I didn't sign up to be broke and humiliated alongside a man whose company is collapsing on live financial news. I'm sorry. I hope it works out for you. I really do. But I can't do this." The line went dead before Alexander could respond, and he sat at a red light staring blankly at the phone in his hand, feeling something crack open inside his chest. Not grief exactly, but something close to it. The sudden, jarring realization that the woman he had been secretly promising a new life to had only ever wanted the version of him that came with unlimited money attached. The light turned green. A car behind him honked. Alexander drove forward in a daze, his mind now a chaotic storm of half-formed thoughts. Harrington Capital, frozen accounts, a board meeting in 30 minutes, a wife he couldn't reach, a mistress who had just abandoned him over a declined credit card. By the time he arrived at the Whitmore Ventures headquarters downtown, the building that had once made him feel like a king walking through his own kingdom now felt cold, unfamiliar, watchful. Employees who normally greeted him with cheerful nods in the lobby now glanced away quickly when he passed, whispering to each other the moment they thought he was out of earshot. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like it took an hour. David was waiting for him outside the boardroom, his face pale, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. "Alexander," David said quietly, "before you go in there, I need you to understand something. This isn't a routine review. They've already made their decision." "What do you mean, already made their decision? The meeting hasn't even started." "I mean, the vote has already happened," David said. "Overnight. Proxy authorization, executed at 5 a.m. They didn't call this meeting to discuss anything, Alexander. They called it to inform you." Alexander felt something cold settle into his chest. "Inform me of what?" David hesitated, glancing toward the closed boardroom doors. "I think you should hear it from them." Alexander pushed past him and shoved the door open. The boardroom fell silent the moment he entered. 12 members of the board sat around the long table, most of them avoiding his eyes. And at the head of the table, in the seat that had always belonged to Alexander himself, sat a man he had never met before. Gray-haired, sharp-suited, with the calm, unhurried demeanor of someone who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one, delivering exactly this kind of news. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, rising slightly and extending a hand that Alexander did not take. "My name is Jonathan Pierce. I represent Harrington Capital's interests on this board, effective this morning." Alexander stared at him, his mind racing to place the name, some distant echo of familiarity he couldn't quite grasp. "I don't understand. This is my seat, my company." "Please sit down," Jonathan said, gesturing to an empty chair near the middle of the table, not the head, and the small, deliberate cruelty of that gesture, being seated as a guest in what had always been his own boardroom, landed on Alexander like a physical blow. He sat. "Mr. Whitmore," Jonathan began, folding his hands on the table in front of him, "as of 6 this morning, Harrington Capital and its affiliated trusts hold 63% of voting shares in Whitmore Ventures. This position has, in fact, existed for a number of years through nested holding structures, but was only consolidated into a single reporting entity overnight for the purposes of this meeting." "That's not possible," Alexander said, his voice rising. "I would have seen that in every filing, every funding round. I've reviewed the cap table personally 100 times. "You reviewed what you were shown," Jonathan said calmly. "The structure was designed, quite deliberately, to remain discreet. That was never illegal, Mr. Whitmore, simply private. Many families structure their investments this way for reasons that have nothing to do with the companies they're invested in." "Then why now?" Alexander demanded, his voice cracking slightly with something between fury and panic. "Why consolidate now, overnight, and call an emergency meeting? What triggered this?" Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Mr. Whitmore." The room went very quiet. "This isn't about the company," Alexander said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his face like a slow, sickening sunrise. "Is it?" "No," Jonathan said, "it isn't." "Who is she?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Who does Claire actually belong to?" A murmur ran through the boardroom, several board members exchanging startled glances, clearly hearing for the first time the personal connection at the center of what they'd assumed was purely a financial dispute. Jonathan opened the folder in front of him and slid a single document across the polished table toward Alexander. "I believe you should read this before we continue." Alexander's hands shook slightly as he picked it up. It was a summary document, formal, precise, listing the ownership structure of Harrington Capital's core family trust, and near the top of the page, under the heading of principal beneficiaries, was a name that made the room spin around him: Claire Elizabeth Harrington. "Your wife," Jonathan said quietly, "is the youngest daughter of the late Robert Harrington, founder of Harrington Capital, and one of the primary beneficiaries of the family trust that has held a controlling interest in this company since before you ever founded it." Alexander stared at the paper in his hands, reading the words over and over, as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. "That's not possible. Claire doesn't come from money. Claire worked at an art gallery. Claire never once in 8 years mentioned—" "Claire chose not to disclose her family background," Jonathan said, "for reasons that were entirely her own, and frankly, Mr. Whitmore, reasons that seem increasingly understandable given what I witnessed reviewing the events of last night." Alexander's face went pale. "What do you mean, what you witnessed?" Jonathan's voice grew quieter, more deliberate, each word landing like a small, precise blade. "I mean that at approximately 11:40 last night, I received a phone call from your wife, standing barefoot outside her own home in a rainstorm, informing me that her husband had physically pushed her out the front door and locked it behind her." The room went utterly silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly hearing this detail for the first time, their expressions shifting from professional neutrality into something closer to disgust. "That's not what happened," Alexander said quickly, too quickly, his voice tight with panic. "We had an argument. She left on her own." "Did she?" Jonathan said flatly, "lock herself outside her own front door?" Alexander had no answer. "Mr. Whitmore," Jonathan continued, his voice never rising, never losing its calm, controlled cadence, which somehow made every word land harder than if he had shouted, "I have known Claire Harrington since she was a child. I watched her grow up in a family that gave her every advantage imaginable, and I watched her walk away from all of it because she wanted, more than anything, to be loved for exactly who she was rather than what she was worth. She found you at a moment in her life when she was searching for that, and you spent 8 years slowly convincing her she was worthless without you. That's not—" "I'm not finished," Jonathan said, and something in his tone made Alexander close his mouth immediately. "Last night,
After everything you did, your wife had every legal right, every justified reason, to bury you, to destroy your company, seize every asset, ruin your reputation so thoroughly you'd never work in this industry again. She had that power in her hands the entire time you were locking her outside in the rain, Mr. Whitmore, and instead of using it out of cruelty, she used it out of clarity. There's a difference, and I don't expect you to understand it, because understanding that difference would require a level of self-awareness you have shown no evidence of possessing. The room remained dead silent. Alexander felt sweat beading along his hairline, despite the cold air conditioning humming overhead. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice small, stripped of every ounce of the commanding confidence he'd walked in with. Jonathan folded his hands again, his expression settling into something almost clinical. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from your position as Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Ventures, pending full investigation into the financial irregularities discovered in company accounts over the past night. Your access to all company systems, accounts, and properties has already been revoked. You can't do this without a formal vote." "The vote already occurred," Jonathan said. 63% in favor. "It isn't close, Mr. Whitmore." Alexander looked around the table, searching desperately for a single sympathetic face among the board members he'd worked alongside for years, men and women he'd hired personally, promoted, celebrated at company holiday parties. Not one of them met his eyes. "David," Alexander said, turning toward his CFO, the closest thing to a friend he had in that room. "Say something." David looked down at the folder in his hands, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I have to protect the company. I have to protect the employees who work here. I can't do that by protecting you." Something inside Alexander seemed to collapse quietly in that moment, some final structural support giving way beneath years of assumed invincibility. "There's one more matter," Jonathan said, sliding a second document across the table. "Regarding your residence." Alexander looked down at the paper without picking it up this time, some instinct telling him he already understood what it would say. "The property you have occupied for the past 8 years," Jonathan continued, "was never owned by you or by Whitmore Ventures. It has always belonged to the Harrington Family Trust, leased to you through a structure designed for tax efficiency and privacy, unrelated to your marriage. As of this morning, the trust is exercising its right to reclaim the property, effective immediately." "You're evicting me," Alexander said, the words barely audible. "From my own home." "From a home you never owned," Jonathan corrected gently, though there was nothing gentle in the way the words landed. "A legal team will arrive at the property this afternoon to formally document the transition. I'd recommend you gather any personal belongings before then." Alexander stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and for a moment he stood there, breathing hard, staring around the table at the faces of people who had spent years deferring to him, admiring him, competing for his approval, all of them now looking at him with something between pity and quiet satisfaction. "This is insane," he said, his voice shaking now with a mixture of fury and something closer to desperation. "One night, one argument, and you people are going to destroy everything I built over the past 8 years because of one bad night? You didn't build this company alone, Mr. Whitmore," Jonathan said quietly, standing now as well, buttoning his suit jacket with slow, deliberate movements. "You built it on money you never fully understood the origin of, in a house you never actually owned, married to a woman whose family quietly protected and enabled every success you ever claimed as entirely your own. Last night wasn't the reason this happened. Last night was simply the moment your wife finally stopped protecting you from the consequences of who you really are." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked around the room one final time, at the empty chair that had been his for 8 years, at David's downcast eyes, at the cold, professional faces of board members already mentally moving past him toward whatever came next for the company without him in it. He turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and as he passed the glass walls of offices he had personally designed, employees looked up briefly and then away again, no longer meeting his eyes, no longer needing to pretend respect they'd apparently never fully felt. By the time he reached the elevator, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely press the button. His phone buzzed.
a text from an unknown number. "This is Marcus Harrington. My sister asked me to inform you that a legal team will arrive at the residence at 3 p.m. today to formalize the property transition. Please have your personal items ready for removal." Alexander stared at the message, his chest tightening painfully. "Marcus Harrington," he typed with trembling fingers. "Who are you people?" The response came almost instantly. "We're the family you married into and never once bothered to ask about. 3 p.m. Don't be late." The elevator doors opened. Alexander stepped inside, alone, and as the doors slid shut, he caught his own reflection in the polished metal surface, hollow-eyed, pale, unrecognizable as the man who had confidently shoved his wife out into a storm less than 12 hours earlier. He drove home in a daze he couldn't fully explain, running red lights he barely registered, his mind replaying fragments of the boardroom conversation over and over. Claire Harrington, 63%, you never actually owned it, searching for some thread of logic that might unravel the nightmare he'd woken up inside. When he arrived at this mansion, the house looked exactly the same as it always had from the outside. Elegant, imposing, undeniably his. He sat in his car in the driveway for nearly 10 minutes, unable to make himself go inside, some part of him still hoping that if he simply refused to accept what had happened, it might somehow reverse itself. His phone rang. Claire. His heart leapt painfully in his chest, and he answered before the first ring finished. "Claire, thank God. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. Tell me we can fix this." There was a long pause before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was calm in a way that frightened him more than any anger could have. "I'm not calling to fix anything, Alexander. Claire, please, I'm begging you. Whatever I did wrong last night, I'll make it right. I'll do anything." "You didn't do anything wrong last night," Claire said quietly. "Last night you simply stopped hiding who you'd always been." "That's not fair. You know that's not fair." "What isn't fair?" Claire said, and for the first time something sharp cut through the calm in her voice. "Is 8 years of you telling me I was lucky to have you. What isn't fair is you convincing me to leave a job I loved because it embarrassed you. What isn't fair is you making me feel small in front of your colleagues, your friends, your family, over and over, until I genuinely believed I would be nothing without you standing beside me." "Claire, what isn't fair," she continued, her voice rising slightly now, cracking with an emotion she'd clearly been holding back all night, "is you pushing me out into a storm because I asked a reasonable question about missing money. What isn't fair is you locking that door and walking away to pour yourself a drink while I stood outside freezing, wondering if the man I married had ever actually loved me at all, or if he only loved having someone to control." Alexander sat frozen in his car, tears he hadn't expected burning suddenly behind his eyes. "I did love you, Claire. I do love you." "Maybe you believe that," Claire said, her voice softening slightly, though there was no forgiveness in it, only a kind of exhausted sadness. "But love doesn't lock doors, Alexander. Love doesn't make someone feel small so it can feel big. Whatever you felt for me, it wasn't love, it was ownership. And I am done, entirely done, being something a man owns." "Please," Alexander whispered, "just give me a chance to explain, to apologize properly, face to face." "You'll have your chance," Claire said. "At 3 o'clock. My legal team will be there to walk you through the transition. I won't be present." "Claire, please, I need to see you." "There's nothing left to see, Alexander." Her voice had gone completely flat now, completely final. "The man I fell in love with at that gallery 9 years ago either never existed or died a long time ago, buried somewhere under everything you became. Either way, I'm not interested in digging him back up." The line went dead. Alexander sat in his car for a long time after that, staring blankly through the windshield at the mansion looming in front of him, rain beginning to fall softly again against the glass, and for the first time since the entire nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to cry, not out of grief for Claire exactly, but out of the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had spent 8 years so focused on maintaining control that he had never once stopped to ask himself what, exactly, he was so afraid of losing. He hadn't been afraid of losing Claire. He'd been afraid of losing the version of himself that needed someone smaller beside him to feel important. And now, staring at a house that had never truly been his, married to a woman whose family had quietly enabled every success he'd ever claimed as his own, Alexander Whitmore finally understood, far too late, that the empire he'd spent years building had never actually belonged to him at all. It had only ever been on loan. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the loan would officially come due, Part 4. By 2:45 that afternoon, Alexander still hadn't moved from the study, though he'd changed out of his suit into something more casual, as if dressing down might somehow make the coming hour feel less like an execution. He stood by the window watching the driveway, his stomach twisted into knots, and when the first black SUV rolled through the gates, precisely at 3 o'clock, followed by a second, he felt something in his chest lock up entirely. 4 people stepped out, 2 attorneys he didn't recognize, a woman carrying a tablet and a folder of documents, and Marcus Harrington himself, tall and composed, wearing the same unreadable expression Alexander had seen in the text message photo he'd pulled up obsessively all afternoon, searching for any information about the family he'd apparently married into without ever knowing it. Alexander opened the front door before they could knock, some last shred of pride refusing to let them stand outside the way he'd left Claire standing outside the night before. The irony of that thought hit him so hard he nearly flinched. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice polite but utterly without warmth, "I believe you already know why we're here." "Marcus," Alexander said, extending a hand that hung awkwardly in the air when nobody took it, "I think we should talk, man to man, before any of this becomes official." "There's nothing to discuss," Marcus said. "The paperwork is straightforward. You have until 6 o'clock this evening to remove your personal belongings. Anything remaining after that will be inventoried and stored at your expense, though frankly, given the state of your accounts, I'd suggest you take everything you need today. You can't just walk into my home and—" "It was never your home," the older of the 2 attorneys said flatly, stepping forward with a folder of documents. "It's a matter of public record, Mr. Whitmore, though I understand it wasn't public record you were ever encouraged to review closely." Alexander stood frozen in the doorway as the small group moved past him into the foyer, spreading documents across the same table where he'd once hosted dinner parties for investors, congressmen, minor celebrities, all the people he'd spent years cultivating to reinforce the image of a man who had everything. Now those same marble floors echoed with the quiet, clinical sound of a legal team dismantling his entire life in real time. "I want to speak with Claire," Alexander said, his voice cracking slightly. "Directly. Not through lawyers. Not through you." Marcus looked up from the documents he was reviewing, and for the first time, something flickered behind his composed expression, something closer to genuine anger held carefully in check. "My sister spent 8 years being spoken to through your moods, your silences, your conditions for when she was allowed to feel heard," Marcus said quietly. "She doesn't owe you a direct conversation anymore, Alexander. She's given you more grace in the last 24 hours than most people would have given you after what you did." "What I did was have one bad argument," Alexander said, desperation creeping into his voice now. "One night. You're destroying everything over one night." Marcus set down the folder in his hands and looked at Alexander directly, his eyes hard. "Do you know what my sister told me last night, sitting in front of the fire, still shivering, still barefoot? She told me she almost didn't call anyone. She told me some part of her sat outside that door in the freezing rain and thought about knocking, thought about apologizing for something she never even did wrong, just to avoid the fight, just to make things easier for you. 8 years of marriage, and her first instinct when you locked her outside in a storm was to wonder how she could make it easier on you." Alexander said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. "That's not a bad argument, Alexander," Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "That's what happens to a person after years of being made to feel like their own needs are an inconvenience. You didn't have one bad night. You spent 8 years building toward it." The woman with the tablet cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Harrington, we should proceed with the inventory before the light changes." Marcus nodded, turning back to the documents, and Alexander stood there useless in his own foyer, watching strangers move efficiently through a house he had once commanded like a king, tagging furniture, photographing artwork, cross-referencing everything against records he'd never known existed. He wandered upstairs eventually, numb, and began pulling clothes from his closet, stuffing them haphazardly into suitcases, his hands shaking too badly to fold anything properly. Halfway through, he stopped, sitting down heavily on the edge of the bed he'd shared with Claire for 8 years, staring at the empty space beside him where her belongings had already been quietly removed sometime that morning while he was in the boardroom losing his company. He picked up his phone and dialed her number again, knowing it was pointless, knowing it would go to voicemail, needing to hear her voice regardless, even if it was only the automated recording. To his surprise, she answered. "Claire." His voice broke immediately. "Claire, please, I know you probably won't listen to me, but I need you to hear something." There was a pause, long enough that he thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her voice quiet, controlled, exhausted in a way that hurt him more than anger would have. "I'm listening. I know I can't undo what I did," Alexander said, his words tumbling out fast now, unpracticed, raw. "I know locking you outside was the worst thing I've ever done to another human being, and I know it wasn't the first time I made you feel small. It was just the first time I did it out loud, in a way I couldn't hide behind charm or apologies afterward. Why are you telling me this, Alexander? Because I need you to know I see it now, all of it. Not because I'm losing the company, not because I'm losing the house, but because sitting in that boardroom this morning, watching people I respected look at me like I was something they needed to clean off the bottom of their shoe, I finally understood what it must have felt like for you every single time I made you feel like you didn't matter in your own home." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "That's a very convenient realization, Alexander, coming exactly when you have nothing left. I know how it sounds. Do you?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like a man who only discovered empathy the moment he personally experienced consequences. Not because he cared about the person he hurt, but because he finally understood, in a way that finally mattered to him, what it felt like to lose control over his own life." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the truth of her words land somewhere deep and unavoidable. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "You're completely right, and I hate that you're right, and I hate that it took losing everything for me to even be capable of hearing it." "I don't need you to hate yourself, Alexander," Claire said, her voice softening slightly, though still carrying no warmth toward him, only a kind of weary clarity. "Hating yourself doesn't undo anything. It's just another performance, another way of making this moment about your pain instead of the pain you caused." "Then what do you need from me?" "Nothing," Claire said simply. "I don't need anything from you anymore. That's the entire point. For 8 years, I built my sense of worth around what you needed from me, whether you were happy, whether you approved, whether I'd done enough to earn my place beside you. I'm done doing that. I don't need you to understand, apologize, grow, or change. I just need you to be gone by 6 o'clock. The line went dead. Alexander sat there, holding the phone long after the call ended, staring at the blank screen, feeling something inside him break in a way that felt permanent, irreversible. The sound of a door closing, not with anger, but with something far more devastating: indifference. He finished packing in silence after that, moving mechanically through room after room, gathering what few personal items actually belonged to him rather than to the trust, realizing with each passing minute how little that actually amounted to. His clothes, his watches, a handful of photographs. Everything else, the furniture, the artwork, the cars sitting in the garage, all of it belonged to a life he had only ever been borrowing. Downstairs, Marcus was overseeing the final documentation when Alexander descended the staircase carrying 2 suitcases, looking, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely small. "There's a car waiting outside," Marcus said, not unkindly, simply factually. "It'll take you wherever you need to go tonight." "I don't have anywhere to go," Alexander admitted, the words feeling strange and humiliating leaving his mouth. Everything was here. Marcus studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it. "There's a hotel downtown, prepaid for 1 week. It's not from me, and it's not from Claire. It's from Jonathan, who apparently believes even people who've made terrible choices deserve a roof over their head while they figure out their next move. Alexander felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Tell him I said thank you." "Tell him yourself if you ever get the chance," Marcus said, turning back to the documents in front of him. "Though I wouldn't count on that chance coming soon." Alexander walked toward the front door, suitcases in hand, and paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the house that had been his entire identity for 8 years. The marble floors, the grand staircase, the chandelier he'd once bragged about at a dinner party as though he'd personally selected each crystal, when in reality he now understood he'd simply been living inside someone else's careful design the entire time. He stepped outside into the gray afternoon light, and as he walked toward the waiting car, he heard the front door close behind him. The same sound that had haunted him all night the evening before, except now he was the one standing on the outside, and there was no wife inside waiting to be let back in. There was no one waiting for him at all. The car pulled away from the mansion, and Alexander watched it disappear behind him in the side mirror, the house growing smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely around a bend in the road. And something about that image, watching his entire former life shrink into nothing through a rearview mirror, felt like the truest thing he'd experienced in years. His phone buzzed. A news alert. Whitmore Ventures. CEO Alexander Whitmore removed amid financial investigation. Harrington Capital assumes controlling interest. He stared at the headline for a long time, watching his own name attached to words like removed and investigation. Words that would follow him now into every future conversation, every job interview, every introduction for the rest of his life. He thought about all the times he'd read similar headlines about other disgraced executives and felt nothing but distant, comfortable judgment, certain it could never happen to him because he was smarter, more careful, more in control. He hadn't been in control of anything. He'd simply been allowed to believe he was. The hotel room Jonathan had arranged was modest by Alexander's standards, though objectively comfortable, the kind of place he would have sneered at years earlier as beneath him. He sat on the edge of the bed that evening, suitcases still unpacked at his feet, and for the first time since the boardroom that morning, he allowed himself to simply sit in silence with everything that had happened. His phone buzzed again, a message from David. "I'm sorry it went down this way. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a monster. I think you're a man who got lost somewhere along the way and never noticed the exits. I hope you find your way back to whoever you were before all this." Alexander read the message 3 times, feeling something raw and unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He typed back a simple response. "Thank you, David, I mean that." He set the phone down and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to actually think, really think, about the person he'd been before Whitmore Ventures, before the mansion, before Claire. He remembered distantly a version of himself in his early 20s, ambitious but not yet cruel, hungry but not yet entitled, someone who had once believed that building something meaningful mattered more than being seen as important. Somewhere along the way, success had rewired something fundamental inside him, teaching him that respect could be manufactured through fear, that love could be secured through control, that people were assets to be managed rather than partners to be cherished. He thought about his own father, a quiet, unremarkable man who had worked the same accounting job for 30 years and never once raised his voice at Alexander's mother, and how Alexander had spent his 20s secretly ashamed of that quiet, ordinary life, promising himself he would build something bigger, louder, more impressive. Never once considering that the steady, unremarkable love his parents shared might have actually been the rarer, more valuable achievement. Across the city, back at the Connecticut estate, Claire sat curled in the same armchair by the fire where she'd spent the previous night, though the fear and adrenaline of 24 hours earlier had settled now into something quieter, heavier, more contemplative. Marcus had returned from overseeing the mansion transition an hour earlier, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence only possible between people who had known each other their entire lives. "How do you feel?" Marcus finally asked. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "Empty," she admitted. "Not sad exactly, just empty, like I spent 8 years carrying something heavy, and now that it's gone, I don't quite know what to do with my hands." Marcus nodded slowly. That makes sense. Does it get better? Claire asked quietly. The emptiness? I think it turns into something else eventually, Marcus said. Not immediately, but eventually. Dad used to say the hardest part of surviving something isn't the surviving itself. It's figuring out who you're supposed to be once the surviving is finished. Claire pulled her knees up to her chest, staring into the fire. I don't even know who that person is anymore. I spent so long being Alexander's wife that I forgot what it felt like to just be Claire. Then maybe that's the next chapter, Marcus said gently. Not rushing to figure out who you are, but just allowing yourself to remember, slowly, without anyone standing over your shoulder, telling you who you're supposed to become. Claire managed a small, tired smile. When did you get so wise? Somewhere around the 4th hour of overseeing an eviction inventory this afternoon, Marcus said dryly, and Claire actually laughed, a small surprised sound that felt foreign in her chest after the intensity of the past day. How did he seem? Claire asked after a moment, her voice more hesitant now. When you saw him leave? Marcus considered this question carefully. Smaller, he finally said. Not physically, just smaller than the man who's been walking around acting like he owned the world for the past 8 years. Claire nodded slowly, staring into the flames. I keep waiting to feel triumphant, like I thought I would, watching everything collapse around him. But mostly I just feel tired. That's grief, Claire, Marcus said quietly. Even when the marriage was wrong, even when the man wasn't who you needed him to be, you still lost 8 years of your life to something you believed in. It's allowed to hurt, even when leaving was the right decision. Claire wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the sudden sting of tears she hadn't expected. I hate that some part of me still misses who I thought he was. The man from the gallery that first night. He doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he never did. Maybe he did for a little while, Marcus offered gently, and maybe success and money and power slowly ate him alive until there was nothing left of that man but the parts that scared you. It doesn't mean what you felt for him back then wasn't real. It just means people can lose themselves so completely that the person you fell in love with simply stops existing. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the fire crackling softly, rain beginning to fall again outside the windows. Gentler this time, less violent than the storm of the night before, as though even the sky had exhausted itself. What happens now? Claire finally asked. With the company? With everything? Whitmore Ventures will likely be restructured under new leadership within the month, Marcus said. The board's already discussing candidates. The company itself is solid, Claire. It always was. That's why Dad backed it originally. Alexander built something real, even if he built it standing on a foundation he never fully understood. And the mansion? The trust will likely sell it eventually, or repurpose it. Neither of us needs to live there, and frankly, I don't think you'd want to. Claire shook her head. No, I never want to see that house again. Then it settled. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand gently. You get to build something entirely new now, Claire. No inheritance, no marriage, no expectations attached. Just you, finally free to decide who you actually want to be. Claire looked at her brother for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not quite hope yet, but something adjacent to it, some small, fragile possibility beginning to take root where 8 years of quiet erosion had left only empty ground. I think I want to go back to the foundation, she said slowly, almost surprised by her own words as she spoke them. Not as a hobby this time, not as something I do until my husband decides it's embarrassing. I want to actually build something there, something real, something that helps people who never had access to the kind of resources our family takes for granted. Marcus smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile Claire had seen from him since she'd walked back into his life the night before. Now that, he said, sounds exactly like the sister I remember. Across the city, in a hotel room that felt increasingly like a cell despite its comfortable furnishings, Alexander Whitmore lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation from the past 24 hours on an endless loop, searching for the exact moment everything had gone wrong, and slowly, painfully, realizing there hadn't been just one moment, There had been 1,000 small moments, stretched across 8 years, each one so small on its own that he'd never noticed the pattern forming. The slow accumulation of cruelty disguised as ambition, of control disguised as love, of a marriage slowly transformed into ownership without either of them fully realizing when the transformation had occurred. He thought about Claire standing in the rain, barefoot, watching him through the window as he settled comfortably into his chair with a drink, believing he had won something. He thought about the expression on her face during that final phone call. Not angry, not vengeful, just quietly, permanently finished. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore cried, not out of self-pity for what he'd lost, but out of the genuine, devastating understanding of what he'd actually done. And somewhere in the darkness of that unfamiliar hotel room, surrounded by suitcases containing the only pieces of his old life that had actually ever belonged to him, he made a quiet, private promise to himself. Not that he would win Claire back. He understood, with a clarity that hurt more than any board meeting or frozen account ever could, that this particular door had closed permanently, and no amount of apology or growth would ever reopen it. The promise was smaller than that, and somehow larger. He promised himself that if he ever built anything again, whatever small, humbled version of a life remained available to him now, he would build it as someone worth being married to, rather than someone who needed a marriage to feel important. Whether that promise would survive the coming months, stripped of money, status, and the identity he'd spent a decade constructing, remained entirely uncertain. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Whitmore closed his eyes that night without the comfortable armor of arrogance protecting him, and something about that unfamiliar vulnerability, terrifying as it was, felt like the very first honest moment he'd experienced in years. Outside his hotel window, the rain finally stopped completely, the clouds beginning to part just slightly over the city skyline, though neither Alexander lying awake in his borrowed room, nor Claire finally drifting into an exhausted sleep back at the Connecticut estate, could yet see what the coming months would actually bring. Some collapses, after all, are only the beginning of something else entirely. 5. 6 months passed the way healing always does, unevenly, in fits and starts, some weeks feeling like genuine progress, and others feeling like sliding backward into the same grief Claire thought she'd already worked through. But somewhere in the middle of that slow, uneven passage of time, she noticed something had shifted permanently inside her, something that no longer bent the moment someone raised their voice or questioned her decisions. She was sitting in her office at the Harrington Foundation on a Tuesday morning in late spring when her assistant knocked gently on the open door. "Claire, you have a visitor. He doesn't have an appointment." Claire looked up from the grant proposal she'd been reviewing, a program designed to fund small art initiatives in underserved communities across 3 states, work that had filled the empty space inside her chest more completely than she'd ever expected possible. "Who is it?" Her assistant hesitated. "He says his name is Alexander Whitmore." Claire's pen stopped moving. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring at the half-finished sentence on the page in front of her, feeling something complicated rise in her chest. Not fear exactly. She'd stopped fearing him months ago, but something closer to unwelcome surprise. Did he say what he wants? He said he understands if you don't want to see him. He said he'd wait outside as long as necessary, but he wanted to ask you something in person, just once, and then he'd never bother you again. Claire sat with that for a moment, weighing the small, stubborn curiosity fighting against her instinct to simply have him escorted out. Finally, she set down her pen. "Give me 5 minutes, then send him in." She used those 5 minutes to breathe, to remind herself of everything she'd built in the months since that storm. The foundation work, the quiet apartment in the city she'd chosen entirely for herself, the friendships she'd slowly rebuilt with people she'd drifted from during her marriage, the version of herself she'd been steadily reconstructing piece by piece. She reminded herself that whatever Alexander Whitmore wanted from her now, he no longer held any power over what she decided to give. When he walked into her office, Claire almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, noticeably, and the expensive tailored suits were gone, replaced by something simpler, more ordinary. His face looked older, lined in ways it hadn't been 6 months earlier, but there was something else different about him too, something in the way he carried himself, quieter, less certain of the space he occupied. "Claire," he said, standing awkwardly near the doorway. "Thank you for seeing me." "You have 5 minutes," Claire said, not unkindly but firmly, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "What do you want to ask me?" Alexander sat down slowly, his hands folding in his lap, and for a moment he simply looked at her, taking in the office, the framed grant certificates on the wall, the small stack of community outreach folders on her desk. "You built all this," he said quietly, "in 6 months." "I built this because I finally had room to," Claire said. "What did you want to ask me, Alexander?" He nodded, seeming to gather himself. "I wanted to ask whether the apology I never properly gave you would mean anything at all at this point, or whether it's too late for it to matter." Claire studied him for a long moment. "Why does it matter to you whether it means something to me? What are you actually asking?" "I'm asking," Alexander said slowly, "because I've spent the last 6 months in therapy, actual therapy, twice a week, trying to understand how I became the man who could lock his own wife outside in a storm and feel justified doing it. And every session, I keep circling back to the same realization, that I owe you an apology that isn't about winning you back, isn't about redemption, isn't about making myself feel better, just an apology, because you deserve one, and I never gave you one properly." Claire felt something shift in her chest, cautious, guarded, but genuinely surprised. "Go on." "I'm sorry," Alexander said, his voice cracking slightly. "Not for the accounts, not for the company, not for any of the things that actually cost me something. I'm sorry for 8 years of making you feel like your worth depended on my approval. I'm sorry for isolating you from people who loved you. I'm sorry for the gallery job, for the friends I convinced you to distance yourself from, for every single moment I made myself feel bigger by making you feel smaller. And I'm sorry that it took losing absolutely everything for me to understand what I'd actually taken from you long before that." Claire sat quietly for a long moment, letting the words settle, testing them against the wound she'd carried for so long, searching for whether they landed as genuine or as another performance. "Thank you for saying that," she finally said. "I believe you mean it." Something in Alexander's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Do you?" "I do," Claire said, "but Alexander, meaning an apology and deserving forgiveness aren't the same thing. I appreciate that you've done the work. I hope you continue doing it, but I don't owe you absolution just because you finally arrived somewhere I needed you to be 8 years ago." "I understand that," Alexander said quickly. "I'm not here for forgiveness. I promise you, I'm not here to ask for anything else. I just needed you to hear it directly, from me, not through lawyers or headlines." Claire nodded slowly. "What are you doing now? With your life, I mean?" Alexander managed a small, tired smile. "Working, actually. A friend from business school offered me a position at a small consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, nothing that comes with a corner office or a mansion. I'm learning what it feels like to build something slowly, honestly, without cutting corners or stepping on people to get there faster." "That's good," Claire said, and she meant it, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant it. "I hope it's teaching you something real." "It is," Alexander said. "Every single day, it's teaching me something I should have learned decades ago." He paused, glancing around the office once more before standing. "I should let you get back to your work. Thank you, Claire, genuinely, for seeing me, for hearing me out, for not owing me anything and giving me a few minutes anyway." He turned to leave, and when he reached the doorway, he paused, looking back at her one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you look happy, genuinely happy, in a way I don't think I ever saw during our marriage. I'm glad, even though I know I don't get to take any credit for it." Claire watched him go, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway, and sat with the strange, complicated stillness that settled over her afterward. Not quite peace, but something moving steadily in that direction. That evening, she told Marcus about the visit over dinner at his apartment, the two of them sharing takeout containers spread across his coffee table the way they used to when they were children, sneaking food up to their rooms past their parents' rules. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus asked, watching her carefully. Claire considered the question honestly before answering. "Lighter," she finally said. "Not because I forgave him. I'm not sure I have, not fully, and I don't think I need to in order to move forward. But hearing him actually take responsibility, without making excuses, without trying to win something from me, it closed something I didn't realize was still open." "That's growth," Marcus said. "For both of you, in different ways." Claire smiled faintly, picking at the food in front of her. "I keep thinking about something Jonathan told me the night everything started. He said real power doesn't need to prove itself. I didn't fully understand what he meant that night. I understand it now." "What do you mean?" "I could have destroyed him completely," Claire said quietly. "Not just the company, not just the house. I could have made sure he never worked again, never rebuilt anything, spent the rest of his life paying for what he did to me. Part of me wanted that first night, standing in the rain. But somewhere along the way, I realized that using all my power to crush someone doesn't actually prove I have power. It just proves I'm as afraid as he was, just in a different direction." Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "Dad would be proud of you. Not for building an empire or protecting the family name or any of the things people usually measure success by. He'd be proud of the fact that you had every reason to become cruel, and you chose not to." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected, but not unwelcome. "I miss him," she said quietly. "I wish he could have met the person I'm becoming now." "He already knew," Marcus said gently. "That's why he built the safety net you never even knew you had. He knew, somehow, that one day you'd need it. He just hoped you'd never have to find out." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the evening settling around them, and Claire found herself thinking about the strange, winding path that had brought her back to this exact moment, sitting with her brother in an ordinary apartment. No mansion, no empire, no husband waiting to remind her how lucky she was to exist beside him. Just the quiet, steady presence of family that had been there the entire time, waiting patiently for her to remember she was allowed to come home. Over the following months, Claire poured herself fully into the Foundation's work, expanding programs into cities that had never had access to arts funding, mentoring young curators who reminded her, achingly, of the woman she'd been before she buried herself inside someone else's expectations. She started attending gallery openings again, not as someone's wife, not as an heiress performing generosity for social credit, but simply as Claire, a woman who loved art and had finally found her way back to the life she'd once walked away from in search of something that turned out to be an illusion. She reconnected with old friends, including her college roommate, who cried on the phone for nearly 20 minutes when Claire finally called after years of distance, apologizing for disappearing, for making excuses, for allowing herself to be slowly cut off from the people who had loved her before anyone knew the Harrington name. "I always wondered if you were okay," her friend admitted through tears. "I never knew how to reach you without it seeming like I was accusing him of something." "You weren't wrong to worry," Claire said softly. "I wasn't okay. I am now. I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back." "You're here now," her friend said. "That's what matters." Slowly, deliberately, Claire began rebuilding a life that belonged entirely to her, one relationship, one project, one quiet Sunday at a time, and with each passing month, the woman she had been before the mansion, before the isolation, before the slow architecture of control that had nearly swallowed her whole, came more clearly back into focus. Nearly a year after that storm, Claire stood at the opening of a new gallery space the Foundation had helped fund, a converted warehouse now filled with work from emerging artists who otherwise would never have had a platform. And as she watched the room fill with people genuinely moved by the art around them, she felt something settle inside her chest that she hadn't fully felt in longer than she could remember. Wholeness. Not happiness exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but something deeper, more foundational, the sense of being fully, unapologetically herself in a room without needing anyone's permission to take up space. Jonathan found her near the back of the gallery, admiring a large, abstract piece rendered in deep blues and golds, and stood beside her quietly for a moment before speaking. "Your father would have loved this piece," he said. Claire smiled, studying the brushstrokes. He would have pretended not to understand it, then bought it anyway, because he secretly loved it. Jonathan laughed softly. That sounds exactly like him. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the crowd move through the gallery, the low hum of conversation and laughter filling the space with a warmth that felt entirely different from the cold, performative elegance of the parties Claire used to host at the mansion. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said quietly. "Of course. Do you ever wonder if I made the wrong choice? Not leaving Alexander, that part I know was right, but choosing not to destroy him completely when I had every legal right to." Jonathan considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," he finally said, "that the version of you who chose restraint over vengeance is the same version of you standing in this gallery right now, surrounded by people whose lives you've genuinely improved, building something meaningful instead of something bitter." "I don't think those two things are unrelated, Claire. I think choosing not to destroy him is part of what allowed you to build all of this instead." Claire nodded slowly, letting the words settle into place alongside everything else she'd learned over the past year. "I used to think power meant never letting anyone see you as weak. Now I think it means being strong enough not to need anyone to see you that way at all." "Your father used to say something similar," Jonathan said. "He always told me the wealthiest people he ever met weren't the ones with the most money. They were the ones who never needed to prove they had any." Claire smiled, thinking of her father, of the quiet dignity he'd carried through decades of building something far larger than himself, never once needing to announce his own importance to a room. And she understood, standing there in a gallery full of art and laughter and second chances, that she had finally become the daughter he'd always believed she could be, not because she'd inherited his fortune, but because she'd finally reclaimed the strength he'd tried to teach her long before Alexander Whitmore ever walked into her life and nearly convinced her to forget it. Across the city that same evening, in a modest apartment far removed from the mansion he'd once called his kingdom, Alexander Whitmore sat at a small kitchen table, reviewing notes for a client presentation the following morning. The work slow and unglamorous, but honestly earned, each small success feeling more meaningful than any deal he'd ever closed during his years running Whitmore Ventures. His phone buzzed, a message from David, who had stayed in touch despite everything, one of the few relationships from his old life that had survived the collapse intact. "Saw an article about the Harrington Foundation's new gallery opening tonight. Looked like a beautiful event. Thought you'd want to know she's doing incredible work." Alexander stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something bittersweet settle in his chest, gratitude and grief tangled together in a way he was slowly learning to accept as simply part of moving forward. "Thank you for telling me," he typed back. "I'm glad she's thriving. She deserves every bit of it." He set the phone down and looked around his small apartment, modest, unremarkable, nothing like the mansion that had once defined his entire identity, and felt something unexpected settle over him. Peace. Not the hollow, performative confidence he'd mistaken for peace during his years of wealth and control, but something quieter, more honest, the kind of peace that only comes from finally facing exactly who you are, flaws and failures included, and choosing, deliberately, one honest day at a time, to become someone better. He would never fully repair what he'd broken with Claire. He understood that now, completely, without the desperate hope that had colored his visit to her office months earlier. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple, dignified recognition that healing sometimes requires permanent distance rather than reconciliation. But he could still build something meaningful from the wreckage of who he used to be, not to win her back, not to prove anything to the board members who had once respected him or the investors who had once courted his approval. Simply because, for the first time in his adult life, he wanted to become a genuinely good person, not because it would benefit him, but because it was finally, simply, the right thing to do. Back at the gallery, as the evening wound down and guests began filtering out into the warm spring night, Claire stood near the entrance, watching the last of the crowd disperse, feeling a deep, settled satisfaction at everything the evening had represented. Not just for the artists whose work now hung proudly on those walls, but for the version of herself who had fought her way back to standing in a room like this one, unafraid, unashamed, entirely her own. Marcus approached, holding 2 glasses of wine, offering one to his sister. To the Harrington Foundation, he said, raising his glass, and to my sister, who built something extraordinary out of the wreckage of something that nearly broke her. Claire raised her glass, meeting her brother's eyes with a warmth that had taken nearly a year to fully return. To starting over, she said quietly, and to finally remembering who I was before I let someone convince me I needed permission to be her. They clinked glasses, and Claire looked out over the gallery one final time at the art, the people, the life she had rebuilt piece by careful piece from a storm that had once threatened to destroy everything she believed about herself. She thought about that night, barefoot in the freezing rain, watching Alexander through the glass as he settled comfortably into his chair, believing he had won something. She understood now, completely, that he had never actually won anything at all. He had simply revealed in one careless, cruel moment exactly who he had always been beneath the charm and the money and the carefully constructed image of a man in complete control. And in doing so, he had given her, without ever intending to, the single greatest gift of her adult life. The truth. The truth about her marriage. The truth about her own strength. The truth about the difference between being loved and being owned, between control disguised as devotion and genuine partnership built on mutual respect. Claire Harrington stood in her gallery that evening, surrounded by everything she had built from nothing but her own resilience and the quiet, unwavering support of a family that had never truly abandoned her, even during the years she'd tried her hardest to disappear from their world. She had lost a marriage, but she had found herself, and in the end, standing tall in a life entirely her own, built on truth instead of illusion, on respect instead of control, on genuine strength instead of borrowed power. Claire Harrington understood, with absolute and unshakable certainty, that some doors close not to punish you, but to finally set you free. Real power was never about what you could destroy. It was about what you had the strength to walk away from and the wisdom to build in its place. And that, more than any mansion, any fortune, any empire built on someone else's silent sacrifice, was the truest inheritance Claire Harrington would ever claim as entirely her own. 2 years passed before Claire Harrington found herself standing in front of a podium she never expected to occupy, addressing a room full of strangers who had gathered not because of her last name, not because of the fortune attached to it, but because of the work she had spent 2 years quietly building with her own 2 hands. The Harrington Foundation for Emerging Arts had grown from a single gallery space into something far larger than Claire had ever imagined possible, funding programs across 11 states, mentoring hundreds of young artists who would never have found a platform otherwise. And on that particular evening, the foundation was being honored with a national award for community impact, an award Claire hadn't even known existed until Marcus called her 3 months earlier, laughing in disbelief as he read her the nomination letter over the phone. "They want you to accept it in person," he'd said. "In front of cameras, Claire. In front of press." "Absolutely not," she'd answered immediately. But somewhere between that phone call and the night of the ceremony, something in Claire had shifted. Some quiet recognition that hiding from visibility wasn't strength. It was just a different kind of cage, one she had built for herself this time, instead of having it built around her. So she stood at that podium, wearing a simple navy dress instead of anything designed to announce wealth or status, and she looked out at the room, at faces she recognized from years of foundation work, alongside faces she'd never seen before, and she spoke. "6 years ago," Claire began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands, "I was a woman who had forgotten her own name. Not literally. I had forgotten who I was underneath the roles other people needed me to play. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that being small made me safe, that disappearing into someone else's life made me loved. It took losing almost everything I thought defined me to understand that the opposite was true the entire time." The room had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when a speech stops being performance and becomes something honest. "This foundation exists," Claire continued, "because somewhere in the wreckage of a life I thought I wanted, I found the woman I actually was, an artist, A believer in second chances, someone who understands more than most what it feels like to be told your worth is conditional and how transformative it is when someone finally hands you a platform and says, simply, be exactly who you are. That's what we try to give the artists we fund. Not charity, not rescue, just the room to become fully themselves, the way someone once should have given that room to me, and eventually I had to build it for myself instead. The applause that followed lasted longer than Claire expected, and as she stepped down from the podium, her eyes caught Jonathan standing near the back of the room, clapping with unmistakable pride, and beside him, Marcus, wiping at his eyes in a way he would later deny entirely. After the ceremony, as guests mingled with champagne and quiet conversation, a woman approached Claire, young, maybe 26, wearing a dress that looked handmade, carrying herself with the particular nervous energy of someone working up the courage to say something important. "Miss Harrington," she said, "I don't want to take much of your time. I just wanted to tell you that the grant your foundation gave me 3 years ago is the reason I still make art at all. I was ready to quit. I had a job lined up in insurance, actually. Boring, stable, exactly what everyone told me I should want. And then I got the letter from your foundation, and it felt like someone finally saw something in me that I had almost stopped believing was there." Claire felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and overwhelming. "What's your name?" "Sophia," the young woman said. "Sophia Reyes." "Sophia," Claire repeated, holding the name carefully, the way she held every name of every artist the foundation had touched, because each one represented a small act of restoration she understood more intimately than most people ever would. "I'd love to see your work sometime, if you're willing to show me." Sophia's face lit up in a way that reminded Claire achingly of herself 9 years earlier, standing in a small gallery on a rainy Thursday evening, believing for the first time that someone actually saw her. "I would be honored," Sophia said. "Truly." As the evening wound down, Claire found herself standing near the tall windows of the event hall, looking out at the city lights spread beneath her, and Jonathan approached quietly, 2 glasses of wine in his hands, offering her one the way he had at countless gatherings over the past 2 years. "Your father would have been insufferably proud tonight," Jonathan said, smiling. "He would have told everyone in that room that he always knew you'd do something extraordinary, conveniently forgetting that he spent your entire childhood terrified you'd disappear into a quiet, unremarkable life just to escape the family name." Claire laughed softly. "He wasn't entirely wrong to worry. I did try to disappear. I just discovered eventually that disappearing and healing aren't the same thing." "No," Jonathan agreed. "They rarely are." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before Jonathan spoke again, his tone shifting slightly, more careful now. "Can I share something with you? Something I probably should have mentioned months ago." Claire turned to look at him, curious. "Of course." "Alexander reached out to my office last week," Jonathan said. "Not about anything legal. He wanted to make a donation to the foundation. Anonymous, he insisted. No acknowledgement, no naming rights, nothing that would connect his name to yours in any public way. Just a contribution, quietly given, no strings attached." Claire felt something complicated move through her chest. Not quite surprise, not quite discomfort, something harder to name. "How much?" Jonathan told her the figure, and Claire's eyebrows lifted slightly. It wasn't an enormous sum, not by the standards of the fortune Alexander had once commanded, but it represented, she understood immediately, a genuinely significant portion of what remained of his rebuilt, modest life. "I told him I'd need to ask you before accepting anything," Jonathan continued. "I wasn't going to make that decision without your knowledge, regardless of his intentions." Claire considered this offer carefully, turning it over in her mind, weighing old wounds against the 2 years of distance and healing that now separated her from the woman who had stood barefoot in that storm. "Accept it," she finally said, anonymously, exactly as he requested. "Not because I owe him anything, and not because it changes anything between us, but because if the money genuinely helps fund another young artist's second chance, then it's doing exactly what it should, regardless of where it originated." Jonathan studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful behind his eyes. "You've changed, Claire, in the best possible way. The woman who called me that first night wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything. The woman standing in front of me now doesn't need him to suffer in order to feel whole. I stopped needing his suffering somewhere around the first year, Claire admitted quietly. It took me a while to understand that forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing either. I don't need him back in my life. I probably never will. But I also don't need to carry the weight of hating him anymore. That weight was mine to put down eventually, and I finally did. That's wisdom most people never reach, Jonathan said. Certainly not by 34. Claire smiled faintly, looking back out over the city lights. I had a good teacher. Actually, several. 3 weeks later, Claire received an unexpected message, forwarded through the Foundation's general contact address rather than sent to her directly, from someone identifying themselves only as a program coordinator at a community center in a small town 2 hours outside the city. Attached to the message was a short video, unpolished, clearly filmed on a phone, showing a modest art classroom filled with children painting at long tables, and in the corner of the frame, quietly helping a young boy mix paint colors, was Alexander Whitmore. The message explained that Alexander had been volunteering at the center for nearly a year, teaching basic art fundamentals to children from low-income families twice a week, entirely unpaid, never mentioning his previous life, never revealing anything about who he used to be, simply showing up consistently, patiently, week after week, helping children discover something Claire understood better than almost anyone: the quiet, transformative power of being taken seriously by someone who believed you had something worth expressing. Claire watched the video 3 times, feeling something unexpected settle in her chest each time, not romantic longing. That particular door had closed permanently, and she felt no desire to reopen it, but something gentler, something that resembled genuine relief. She thought about their conversation in her office 2 years earlier, about the promise he'd made, quietly, almost apologetically, that if he ever built anything again, he would build it as someone worth respecting, rather than someone who needed power to feel important. Watching him in that video, patient and unassuming, helping a child who clearly adored him navigate a paintbrush, Claire understood that he had actually kept that promise. She didn't reach out to him. She didn't need to, and some part of her recognized that reaching out might undo the careful distance both of them had worked hard to maintain. But she forwarded the video to Marcus with a short message. He's actually doing it. Rebuilding, I mean. Really rebuilding, not performing it for an audience. Marcus responded within minutes. People can change, Claire. It just usually takes losing everything to prove they actually meant it. That spring, the Foundation opened its largest project yet, a permanent arts education center built in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods, funded entirely through donations Claire had spent 2 years cultivating, including, quietly, the modest, anonymous contribution that had arrived from Alexander months earlier. The center would offer free classes to children and adults alike: painting, sculpture, photography, music, anything that might give someone the same second chance Claire herself had eventually found. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Claire stood beside Marcus and Jonathan, watching children pour excitedly into the new building, their laughter echoing off freshly painted walls, and she felt something settle inside her chest that had been slowly building for 2 years. A sense of purpose so complete it left almost no room for the grief she used to carry. "You did this," Marcus said quietly, watching the crowd of children alongside her. "All of it. From a woman standing barefoot in a rainstorm to this." Claire shook her head slightly. "I didn't do it alone. None of us do anything alone, Marcus, no matter how much we convince ourselves otherwise. I had you. I had Jonathan. I had Dad's foresight, even though he wasn't here to see any of this. I had every single person who believed in this work before it ever became something real." "Still," Marcus said, "you're the one who chose to build something out of the wreckage instead of just surviving it. That part was entirely yours." Claire watched a young girl, maybe 7 years old, run past them clutching a paintbrush like it was the most precious object she'd ever held. Her face lit up with an excitement so pure, it made Claire's throat tighten unexpectedly. "I used to think the storm that night destroyed my life," Claire said quietly. "It took me a long time to understand it actually saved it." Later that year, On a quiet Sunday afternoon that felt entirely unremarkable until it wasn't, Claire found herself at a small farmer's market near her apartment, wandering between stalls with no particular purpose beyond enjoying an ordinary morning entirely her own. And it was there, examining a display of hand-thrown ceramic bowls, that she struck up a conversation with the potter running the stall, a quiet, unassuming man named Daniel, who spoke about his craft with the kind of genuine passion that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. "You have good hands for this," he said, watching her turn one of the bowls carefully in her palms. "Most people just look. You're actually feeling the weight and the balance." "I used to work in art curation," Claire said. "I forgot how much I missed being close to the actual making of things, rather than just organizing how other people's work gets displayed." "Why'd you stop?" Claire considered this question, surprised by how easily the honest answer rose to the surface. "Life got complicated for a while. I'm slowly finding my way back to the things that actually matter to me." Daniel smiled, something warm and unguarded in his expression that reminded Claire pleasantly this time, rather than painfully, of the version of herself who used to believe good things could simply happen without hidden costs attached. "Well, for what it's worth, I think that bowl in your hands right now knows it belongs with someone who actually appreciates it." Claire laughed, genuinely, easily, the sound surprising her with how natural it felt. "I'll take it then." They talked for nearly 20 minutes after that, about nothing important, about pottery and art, and the particular quiet satisfaction of building something with your own hands. And when Claire finally walked away from the stall, bowl wrapped carefully in brown paper, she realized she was smiling in a way she hadn't smiled in longer than she could remember. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because for the first time in years, an ordinary conversation with a stranger had felt entirely uncomplicated, entirely free of the careful calculations she used to make about what people wanted from her. She returned to that market every Sunday after that, not with any particular expectation, simply because she'd rediscovered the quiet pleasure of ordinary mornings. And over the following months, without either of them rushing anything, without the desperate intensity that had once defined her relationship with Alexander, something slow and gentle began growing between Claire and Daniel, built not on charm or performance or the careful architecture of control, but on the simple, steady foundation of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company without needing anything more complicated than that. When Claire finally told Marcus about him, months into their quiet, unhurried courtship, her brother studied her carefully across the dinner table. "Does he know who you are? The Harrington name, I mean?" Claire smiled, remembering the moment she'd finally told Daniel, watching his face for any flicker of the excitement or calculation she'd learned to recognize instantly after her marriage. "He asked me why I never mentioned it sooner," Claire said. "I told him I wanted him to fall for the version of me that exists without it first. He said that made perfect sense, and then he asked if I wanted to help him glaze pottery that weekend, completely unbothered by any of it." Marcus laughed softly, something relieved in the sound. "That's the one, Claire. That's exactly the one." Claire didn't rush anything. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, the danger of moving quickly into someone else's certainty about who she should become. Instead, she allowed the relationship to unfold slowly, deliberately, giving herself permission to remain entirely herself throughout every stage of it. And for the first time in her adult life, she discovered what it actually felt like to be loved by someone who wanted nothing from her except her honest presence. Nearly 3 years after that storm-soaked night that had once threatened to destroy everything she believed about herself, Claire stood once more at the gallery, where her foundation had first opened its doors, hosting an anniversary celebration surrounded by the artists whose lives had been transformed through the work she'd built. And as she looked around the room at the laughter, the art, the genuine warmth radiating through every corner of the space, she felt something settle permanently into place inside her chest. Wholeness, finally, completely, without qualification. Marcus found her near the same abstract painting she'd admired at the very first opening, and this time, instead of standing beside her in comfortable silence, he simply smiled. "Happy?" he asked. Claire looked around the room one final time, at everything she had built, everything she had survived, everything she had finally allowed herself to become, and nodded slowly, with an absolute, unshakable certainty that required no further explanation. "Completely," she said, and somewhere in that gallery, surrounded by art created by people who had once believed their voices didn't matter, standing in a life built entirely on her own terms, loved by someone who wanted nothing from her except her genuine self, Claire Harrington finally understood, with total and permanent clarity, that the storm which had once locked her outside in the freezing rain had never actually been the ending of her story. It had simply been the door closing on a life that was never meant to be hers, so that a far greater one, built on truth, resilience, and the quiet, unshakable strength she had carried inside herself the entire time, could finally begin. And that, in the end, was the truest triumph of all.